a minor disturbance. It was so very quiet and still in this part of Alaysia, not even the trees or plants swayed, for the breeze was gone. The sun was warm overhead, though not searing. A bird or two chirped with bright musical notes as the flowers and plants stood tall in the sunshine. The butterflies and bees nestled on their favourite flowers, such as the red, white, and yellow sweet peas and blue snapdragons. All the bees seized the opportunity to feed and pollinate the flowers, and were glad as they did so, for they rejoiced in this union, knowing their kind's life would flourish further into forthcoming seasons. The pear, mulberry, and apricot trees, and all types of others, stood tall and were lush with the fruit of the brightest colours, the ripest of their fruit falling to the ground. It would seem that each of these fallen delights were disappointed at not being chosen to be eaten, and so they sat luminously, brighter and sweeter than their branch-laden counterparts, almost as if trying to seduce the wildlife to feed on the succulents they offered. I could see animals of many kinds in the place. The deer were feeding on the lush green grass, as were several hares, and the squirrels nibbled on almonds from the almond trees. The bears drank from the crystal blue water of the streams, and were not at all tempted to eat the salmon and other fish swimming in the streams. If at any time a bright pink salmon offered itself up to a hungry bear, it did so as a willing act, knowing its own fate and relished its very contribution to the harmony of the life cycle of Alaysia. The harmonies were such in Alaysia that the case-in-point salmon felt inside of its own muscles the vibration and energy of any hungry bear that loomed close by. They attuned such rhythms to the fish to be recognized by a bear that was hungry for the sustenance of protein, amino acids, and other goodies from which these salmon could offer. Today was not that day of self-sacrifice, and so the salmon continued to swim upstream to fulfill a different, much more pleasant destiny. And so the bears continued to slurp at the water in the stream, for the bears also knew it was not their time to delight in the salmon's flesh, for it was the time for the salmon to reproduce and replenish. As the bears slurped away, it would look to a keen eye, as though the bears gave a brief nod of hello and a quick blink of the eye. The tail of the salmon seemed to wiggle a little quicker upon noticing this gesture, as if in acknowledgement, and then they hurriedly swam on, eager to be getting on with the season's most delightful task. Much of Alaysia found itself to be in this quiet state of nobility and servitude, as was so recently represented by the salmon and the bear. All of nature itself offered itself as a living sacrifice of one to another, and the result of such an amicable arrangement amongst all was living in blissful harmony. They therefore viewed every living organism as honourable and fitting self-sacrifice of one to another in the land. This kind of servitude was the very heartbeat of peace and prosperity in Alaysia. It was only a moment later that the bears' stomachs were sufficiently full of water that their heads rose from the clear and sweet stream, and they looked up across the river to hills and valleys more than several kilometres away, taking in their surroundings. The hills were still lush in the distance, the sky was still a clear bright blue, and the sun still shone warmly, though it was what the bears could see much farther beyond that caused them to make a soft growl. Beyond the hills and much further into the distance, the sky was a deep grey but not quite black. There was a black puff of smoke that rose rapidly into the air, causing the distant sky to become even darker still. No sound could be heard from such a distance, but the bears cowled back, and they stood upright for just a moment and growled again lightly, and then placed their paws back onto the soft grass, not wanting to be the harbingers of bad news to all of the life forms around them. Much to the relief of the bears, not a single creature appeared to be diverted from their own personal joys. The birds still chirped, the bees still buzzed, and the bunnies still hopped. Even the cats remained curled in their tight balls, basking sleepily in the sunshine. Everything was as it should be, not a creature, except for the bear, seemed to be aware or disturbed by the visions that loomed far away over the hills, for they had recognized these sights from more than several moons ago and knew they held no joy. This particular animal had been blessed with a remarkably long life cycle, which is why they could recall things from such a while ago. These very bears had, in fact, been in existence for more years than anyone could count. It had not been known why the bear's life cycle had been so long, but it was as though they still remained as youthful mammals, maintaining the virility and strength of 3-5-year-old bears. But over the years they had added to this virility the virtue of wisdom, which, to be fair, is what would and should be expected of any creature living in excessive years of life. His life expanse was a great many more than this, but he was not about to give away their true ages. These bears had considered themselves, and were considered by all who were around them, to be the wisest and greatest protectors of all in this province of Alaysia, due to their own accumulated knowledge, brute strength, and highly attuned senses. And as much as any animal is able, they felt laboured with the responsibility to protect all that was around them. The richest in colour and the largest of these brown bears sniffed the air, trying to detect not only the stench of smoke, but any other scent that had no business being in his neck of the woods. His ears twitched, and his nose flared in small, quick movements. Not even the faintest smell of sulphur, or the aroma of the vile two-legged creatures, most likely responsible for the impending carnage, could be smelled, even in the faintest of ways. I could smell all that with a familiar sense of the everyday lives that occurred in the villages and towns that took habitat in the many miles that made the east side of Alaysia. The great bear would immediately take it upon himself to venture to the edge of the safety of the trees of the forest, which was a 2-day hike away for him to determine the distance of trouble. He knew by his own instinct that if he reached the edge of the forest and could not smell any stench, they had time to prepare for safety. He also knew that the sooner he could smell any pungency, he would also have time to return to gather all for safety. Time, regardless of distance, was currently on his side. Without hesitation or even notice of the other bears, the big bear darted through the river and began the trek to the edge of the forest. Upon noticing his rapid departure, 3 of his counterparts followed him over the stream and through the trees, for they too had seen what lay in the distance. The bears had run for miles through pretty and pristine land and forest for what had been half a day without stopping, and they appeared not to be slowing down. Such was the urgency of the big bear to sniff out any emergency. They had run through woodland and clearings, and eventually made it to the orchards, where the woodland folk were dancing and picnicking amongst the fruit trees as the bears ran by. Even the aroma of freshly cooking meat and baked sweets would not deter the bears from their mission. Of the woodland folk, only one man, known for being a notorious jitterbug, had recognized the anomaly of what had just so very briefly transpired before his very assuming eyes. This peculiarity had caused rigid Rickety Rigby, as he was known to the townsfolk, to puff on his pipe of herbal calmative a little more rapidly than usual. It was most definitely known that rigid Rickety Rigby was prone to nerves about even the slightest of things, and this current occurrence had rattled his nerves. This sight of bears was definitely not helping this poor fellow, for he knew it was highly unusual for bears to be so far out of their province, and even more disturbing was to see them moving in full flight. It was a sight that he had witnessed only once before, and terrible calamity had ensued for a long period following, a most serious calamity that he did not want to witness again in his lifetime. Thinking of this caused Rigby to puff a little deeper, to stave off his internal panicky jitters by becoming external panicky jitters. He thought it a good idea, even in spite of his natural inclinations, to keep himself composed and fight his flight instinct. So, with this inclination in mind, instead of running, he would walk with certain deliberation to tell Naeme of what he witnessed. He told himself, not too rapidly though, I shall keep my normal gait and not draw attention to myself. So down he placed his pipe on his little wood stump, not even thinking to put it out. His mind was on getting himself to Naeme as undetected as possible. However, as he began his journey to walk as inconspicuously as possible, it became evident that keeping his normal gait was not his portion, and his arms swung stiffly at his side and were out of rhythm with his legs, which were shuffling perfectly too quickly for his very self to bear. Though, to his own mind, he did not think himself to be walking peculiarly, and so rigid Rickety Rigby trotted along, truly believing himself to be unnoticed by all his peers. So off he went with supreme confidence through the trees and over the grass and back through his little village. He ventured with such focus he almost tripped over the great and wise Naeme, who was snoozing on his deck chair in the sunshine. Naeme opened his eyes, sensing the presence of someone who had blocked his sunshine. The little man gathered himself up, put back his shoulders and straightened his brown jacket, though the jacket still sat on him in full disarray, even after several ragged attempts to straighten it up. Eventually, after much faffing about, Rigby considered the matter of his jacket to be fixed and settled, though any untrained eye would consider the matter of the jacket to be still quite unsolved. Naeme was too polite to mention the spectacle sat bemused and patient, until Rigby had gathered himself up and was content. "You look bothered there, Rigby. What ails you today?" Naeme quickly glanced behind Rigby in the same moments as Rigby tried to gather himself together, and Naeme noticed quite the gathering of townsfolk behind Rigby, and whilst Rigby was distracted, Naeme motioned to the gathering to be quiet by making a shushing sound with his mouth, and then turned his attention back to Rigby. "And where is your pipe? You must be quite ailed to have forgotten that." Rigby, not even thinking of his pipe, leaned forward and brought his finger to his lips, motioning Naeme to be quiet, and then whispered, "I don't wish to alarm anybody. I came to you undetected," then lowered his tone once again, so as not to disturb anyone. After a pause he continued, "It's all looking a bit grave, I reckon, Naeme." Naeme's eyes twinkled. He was always bemused by Rigby's complete and utter lack of awareness of himself and his very involvement in the surrounding environment. It was, in fact, one thing that Naeme had found so charming in his old friend. "It's the bears again, Naeme," he continued in his whisper. Naeme could smell Rigby's herby breath on his face, and it did not too much to cover the mild, odious stench of his breath. "They are running through the forest again in full flight. I just saw them moments ago." "Are they now?" whispered Naeme, and then paused for a moment before he went on. "Now, don't be too hasty and jump to any conclusions just yet there, Rigby. Which way did they run?" "West," Rigby whispered, still leaning in on Naeme. Rigby almost jumped out of skin as he heard someone say, "I'll go check up on the tower, shall I, Naeme?" Rigby, upon hearing this voice, which he had not expected, leapt onto his toes, causing the effect of his shoulders to almost hit his ears as he jerked in an upward motion. He swung about so abruptly his action resulted in the most indelicate pirouette ever to have been witnessed in Alaysia. The end of his act was the entirely hapless Rigby falling unceremoniously as his bottom was abandoned to the ground with a loud thud. A plume of dust flew up around him. This scene brought raucous laughter to the group behind him. Even the usually composed Naeme gave rise to a rich chuckle, but Rigby was left utterly bereft and overcome, and all he could do was cry out from the depth of his lungs, "Where's my pipe? Where's my pipe?" Rigid Rickety Rigby's grand demand left the township in even more uproarious laughter, for everybody knew that this pipe was to Rigby as a dummy to a baby. One of the townsfolk who was not in the slough of laughter had had enough sensibility to have noticed the earlier movements of Rigby during the picnic of one. Though Mrs. Brownstone had not seen the bears for herself, she had noticed Rigby acting with more peculiarity than normal. She had gathered enough wits to pick up his pipe after he waddled off, and even more good sense to clean the old worn pipe quickly and replenish it, knowing Rigby would soon be in for quite the struggle with his wayward wits, and would pine for his pipe. This sensible woman had even the mind to carry a match to light up Rigby's pipe. She made her way quickly to him, and the moment that she was within arm's reach of Rigby, who was still on the ground, snatched his pipe from her hand and placed it with lightning speed into his own mouth. He sucked on his pipe even before it was lit. This caused the group to break out in laughter for a third time in a little more than a few minutes. Mrs. Brownstone kept composure and even frowned a little and lit up the pipe for the silly wanton fellow. All right, simmer down, everyone. Naeme stood up, speaking in his baritone tone. Everybody calmed themselves and stood soberly, waiting for their great man to speak. He motioned to young Harry. Yes, Harry, go and look up on the tower and see what you can see. Hurry, boy, tarry not, and use your ears to hear also, and come back remembering all that you can. Harry, the blond boy of not over 20 years old, nodded and soberly turned south from where he stood and walked through the group, and then broke into a sprint upon his exit from the gathering. The stone tower was just on the edge of the town clearing, and it took him not over 5 minutes to arrive. The tower of stone was built well more than a moon cycle or two ago and stood 30 feet high and was as sturdy as the day it was completed. Harry took the steel staircase that elevated itself around the circumference of the tower, and he took 2 steps at a time, and the clanging of his boots on each step permeated the air, and he felt the sound reverberating through his ears and body. The clang appeared to echo and carry in the air for quite a distance. Soon he stood at the top of the turret, and his eyes scanned the area. He oversaw the length of the clearing that entirely surrounded the tower, and he surveyed the portrait of treetops, which on the south side he could just about reach out and touch with the stretch of his arm. He turned further around, now facing the east, and it was that time of day now that the vivid green of the treetops were having their colour adjusted by the sun descending and causing the slow, faint descent of magenta and various shades of orange and various shades of yellow to skew the distant sky and tree lines. The prettiness of this sunset had caught him up for a moment or two, but luckily a squawking bird behind his head and jarred him from his wonderment. He shook his own head and turned around, and as a result he caught, out of his eye and to the east, the faint flume of grey-black smoke. Harry gave one more quick survey. He noted that no scent could be smelled, except for the cherry blossoms and the lingering fumes of various scents from the sumptuous delights of the day's picnic. Harry descended the tower, and he was right to his decision in his mind that there were no anomalies anywhere, and anomalies were easy to pick here in this part of the land. Everybody knew that. So, the lad concreted in his mind that things were just as they always were, completely perfect and undisturbed, except for the billowing tower of smoke so very far and faint in the distance, and over to the east. Upon Harry's return, he found everyone to be right where he left them. The only thing that changed was that rigid Rickety Rigby was now much like his old self, and that daylight was now surely on the descent. You can't see it from here cause of the trees, but from the tower there is a grey lot of smoke that comes with each one puff out to the east, very far in the distance, and you can't smell it either. Everything else is exactly the same, not another thing to report. Thanks, Whippet. Well, that's it, everyone. Nothing of any real value to know here this evening. Let's not think about it again tonight. Let's wind up the day. The evening has come fast upon us. Eat up for the night and get rested for tomorrow's another day, Naeme said decidedly, and turned to pick up his chair as he headed into his house, where he made for himself a cup of sweet tea, bread and butter with honey for his evening meal. He ate and drank slowly while he waited for the sounds of the townsfolk to quieten, and when they did, he had decided that it was time to call upon the council of various townships of Alaysia quietly. Naeme tapped 3x 3 times in a particular rhythmic action on a little mirrored window, which was 10 centimetres by 10 centimetres, that was positioned quite high on the wall above his little kitchen table. If one could reach up to the little window and look out, it would not be looking upon his little back garden fitted with lawn, daisies and table and chairs, but would instead see what blackness would be. But within this blackness there were colours of various types swirling about, like little comets, and bright silvery white dots chasing silvery grey dots in some kind of merry dance. These dots would tag each, and the game would ensue in reverse. It so happened that this window was built so high, so as not to encourage any nosy Parkers. Naeme had built it high enough for himself to see out of it unobstructed, which he did so now, waiting to see if his call would be answered. His call had been heeded. He took a step back from the window, dragging his table with him as the window morphed itself into a fully sized door and opened itself, ready for his incoming visitors to enter through it. His little table for two had also elongated itself to a large and long table, which had filled a good portion of the room. The tables had only 2 chairs multiplied into 6 chairs, and that is exactly how Naeme knew how many would be at his meeting. And he went to his little kitchen to prepare 2 pots of tea for 8 people. As Naeme was reaching up into his cupboard for tea cakes, he heard a bellowing hello. Without turning around, Naeme called back, "Hello, hello!" Naeme knew the voice of Louis. He also knew that he did not need to turn to face Louis in greeting, as he would already be in position, standing guard by the door, scanning with his bull-like eyes the perimeters of the Naeme's house. Louis grunted in satisfaction, as he could not smell or sense any danger about the place. He took it upon himself to remain in his position and be on guard, just in case. For what Louis did, he guarded. And it seemed to be a position Louis could rarely break rank, for such was his pride with his position and calling. Only moments later, and only moments after, he smelt her scent, which Louis thought to be clove and sandalwood. Then a woman of extraordinary poise and beauty walked in. Her hair was thick, long and dark. Her eyes were pale grey, like the colour of the dress that she wore, and they looked like pools or mirrors, and they always seemed to look right through him even now as she acknowledged him. This pair of eyes had been dizzying him and causing him more than one palpitation since they were children. The only thing that had changed was that her serenity and beauty had only increased. Her skin was as fine as porcelain or silk, and it was so very, very pale, and without a blemish on her lithe frame. Louis's bull-like frame stiffened as she walked through the door. As she gave him a small smile with those full red lips, he nodded back and said, "Olwen." Olwen was making her way over to Naeme when another figure made his way through the door. It was another person of extraordinary beauty, only much larger in frame, his shoulders as wide as Louis's himself, but carried the same ethereal poise as Olwen. He donned white, much shorter hair, but with the same pale complexion and deep blue eyes instead of grey. He wore clothes in soft, earthy tones of silk. He was much bigger than Olwen, but just as elegant. "Arwen," Louis held out his hand, and they both shook it. "Good to see you, Louis." Edwige entered through next, another man of much more earthly beauty. He carried himself with dignity, and was dressed in casual but expensive attire. He was clean-cut and tidy, even though he appeared not to be as delicate as Arwen. Arwen possessed much more physical skill and prowess than Edwige, though you would not know to look at him. Edwige appeared to be more physically able, but was not much used to physical battle or even physical labour. He liked to keep himself fit, but his strength was more in his mental prowess. All the men stood tall. Louis possessed considerably less height and the stockiness and thickness of a bull. He was a heavy-set man full of brawn and muscle. Arwen appeared to be fine-boned, but somehow held up in stature and, in fact, looked as big as Edwige, who was certainly not as finely tuned in structure as Arwen. Edwige himself possessed a fit but more portly structure. Olwen was placing tea on the table, and the 3 men were in conversation when the final counsellor arrived, and the large door behind her transformed back into the little window set high into the wall. It was Allura, a creature who possessed owl-like features. She stood as tall as Olwen, whom she greeted first, and then she greeted all before taking her position at the table. Olwen sat next to her, crossed her legs, and smoothed her dress in her lap. She sipped her tea while everybody took her place. Naeme was the last to take him. He looked around the table, making sure he caught everybody's gaze. "Are you all well wherever you find yourselves?" Naeme asked the siblings. "Are all of your paths clear and your ways straight?" Both Olwen and Arlen nodded once each. "Allura, are your channels clear?" Allura, too, nodded in answer to Naeme. "Edwige, are your houses in order?" "They are," was Edwige's reply. "Louis, are your waters and lands tranquil and your warriors at peace?" "They are." "Are your warriors battle-ready in body and spirit?" "Yes. They are, Naeme. They are all at peace and trained. Naeme breathed a sigh. Good, good. He paused for a moment, and his tone grew more concerned, but without worry he spoke. There is smoke, which appears to be coming from Huxley. I was aware only a few hours ago. It seems that young Hindra is eager to take over his father's work, and it would seem that he has a talent for it too. Allura, have you any knowledge of this? Allura's big owl eyes blinked once, and then she paused before she spoke. I don't have any information about this. It would appear that you are correct, though, Naeme. Hindra does have a talent for his father's work. I myself have no knowledge of what work he is continuing, which makes me concerned that he has learned to block channels. Naeme pursed his lips and took a big gulp of tea before he spoke. Well, it seems that we fly against the wind for the first time. I used to know Alistair well in my youth. I have always felt that I understood him and knew him to have good in him. I could always draw from that and use it to our advantage, but not now. Unlike Alistair, his offspring was conceived and born and raised in ever-present darkness, and it seems that he has learned from and surpassed his father with a passion for dark things. I am worried that we are ill-prepared for what is coming. The table was silent until Allura spoke. We need to rise and activate the three elements, Olwyn. You need to open their paths and clear their channels. Only one of the three knows a greater calling, and she is so young. The other ones have none, so, Olwyn, you need to create the pathways for them to begin and activate their talents. Arwen, you need to make the paths to their gifting straight and without disruption or distraction, and doth them in secrecy. Edwige, you need to clothe them and give them sanctuary and sustenance wherever and whenever they need it. Last, for all of this to occur, Louis, protection of them must be had at all costs. I myself will reactivate and reanimate the fourth talent. Our ancients told us of the great and dark days to come, and they told us what would defeat the darkness. We just don't know how. Naeme tapped the table 3 times and rose from it. His company followed. As they did so, the table reduced itself to ordinary size, and the small window enlarged to a big door, this time to a colour of green. At the sight of this, small exhaling sighs could be heard, and shoulders relaxed. Alaysia had shown them they had hope in the war to come. So, a little more relaxed, each member of the council exited in the exact same manner that they had arrived, with the large green door closing after them and returning to its natural position in the wall, and the room sat as though no one else had been there. Naeme resumed the exact position he had donned previous to his visitors, and resumed eating his toast and drinking his tea, and all was quiet and peaceful and still that night in this little village in Alaysia.